Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar, which is by trainees for trainees. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. We've got Josh Burke from ASIT, Tricia Campbell from BOTA, and Gareth Griffiths, who is the chair of the JCST. And my name's Jane, and I work for the events team, so I'm helping with questions this evening. Please follow the conversation on Twitter. All the Twitter handles are below. Next slide, please. And just going to give you a quick update on the college's activity regarding COVID-19. We have got the information hub, which is being constantly updated, and we've recently made a number of resources available on our e-learning catalogue for free for all members and fellows. These work across the board regardless of your level, so please do take advantage of them. Next slide. And following on from last week's webinar, we have relaunched our confidential support and advice line. So again, if you are experiencing any emotional difficulties or clinical difficulties, you're able to call the helpline and you will receive expert counselling, or peer-to-peer surgical advice is also available. Thank you. Next slide. And that's enough from me. So I'm going to hand you over to our panelists. Tonight we're going to be covering 4 main topics. We'll do some short presentations and then we will ask you to submit your questions. Please start asking questions now, but we'll answer them at the end of each short section. Thank you.
Brilliant. I'm Josh, I'm ASIT President. Thanks to Trish and Gareth for making the call, and to Jane and the English College for hosting the webinar. We also have Sarah Hallett, the BMA JDC Chair, on hand with any specific questions, so make sure you get them in. A lot of the information from tonight's webinar can be found in the multiple documents which have been sent around from the JCST and the 4 educational bodies. What we thought would be useful was to give you some background into the rationale as to perhaps why those decisions have been made in addition to that. The decision made by the MDRS, who's the body responsible for national recruitment and supported by the 4 statutory educational bodies, haven't been taken lightly. And I think it's important to appreciate that they had to be taken at a time when the incidence of coronavirus was rising exponentially. And I think nationally there was great anxiety about the entire workforce across medicine and surgery being pulled into the COVID response. And the SEBs decided right at the beginning to continue training in all specialties, allowing trainees to enter the workforce, to progress at the top and to progress right through wherever possible, and hence selection had to go ahead. I've got a slide about national selection, hopefully you can see it. So surgical trainees in specialties fit into one of 3 application categories: core cardiothoracics, neurosurgery and max-fax are selection processes which were completed before the outbreak began. The second group, other non-general and vascular specialties, and I'll ask Trish to expand on orthopaedics shortly, will or have been judged on self-assessment scores which were submitted before the outbreak without interview. And general and vascular specialties, the third group, will be validated through uploaded evidence in support of their application. Now, this will be completed using the 10% around the lowest successful score, the top 10% and the bottom 10%. So 30% of candidates that go through both general and vascular application processes will be validated. So it's important to appreciate that initially no speciality was afforded the ability to validate using uploaded evidence. Given that general and vascular would be using this as a completely new means of assessment, it was felt that this was appropriate following discussion. And the rationale given for not allowing this in other specialties was one of resource and capacity, and that the self-assessment matrices in these specialties have previously been used before. Clearly, there are huge concerns surrounding this, and in addition to feeding the academy group, ASIT and 12 of the specialty associations wrote to the 4 educational bodies on behalf of trainees to try and express these concerns. And these were included but not limited to the fact that self-assessment matrices only represent a really small proportion of a candidate's overall assessment, and this varies between specialty depending on the application process. We were concerned that when self-scoring, trainees would fit into 3 broad categories. The underscoring candidate, who is modest in anticipation of hopefully being able to clarify or upgrade that score at interview. The second, a candidate who hits the nail on the head and gets their score completely accurate. And the third candidate, who may or may not have insight and overscore themselves with the hope of defending it or qualifying it at interview. And because of this variation and perhaps a position where a lot of applicants find themselves, we felt that validation across all specialties would have provided an equal system and perhaps an extra level of credibility to those successful applicants. In addition to that, and it fits in with that assessment, gender bias in self-assessment is something which we were concerned about, and it's something that we discussed with Gareth and the JCST about how we might go about analysing this disparity through given selection process. A side point, we've had a number of questions about tie breaks, just to mention. The MDRS has issued a hierarchy of domains for self-assessment matrices, which sections are ranked in order of priority should a tie break occur, and those will be used by the selection committees. Clearly, this year's recruitment process is far from ideal, and is something which affects all specialties, not just those in surgery. But we're at a stage where the decision has been made, and we are in an altered recruitment process. And as well as supporting trainees through that process, through to those that get allocated a post to starting in August, I think myself, Trish and Gareth are all keen to work with trainees, the specialty associations, the JCST, and the MDRS, who are in charge of recruitment, to make sure this doesn't set a precedent for future recruitment rounds. Trish, I wonder if you'd mind touching base on some of the issues that orthopaedics have faced in national recruitment. Yeah. That's all right.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with setting a bit of background. So with regard to national selection this year, which has just finished, it's been self-assessment with no validation. The whole time, it's been a fast-moving situation where BOTA members have been represented to HE by a number of groups. So by the SAC, which is the Specialty Advisory Committee, the SDG, which is the Specialty Design Group, JCST. So we've put our feelings across. We've tried to advocate for our members, and it's a situation which we don't agree with, but it's what we're left with. So I want to give a few reassurances. The first thing is we've looked at historical data, which shows that there's good correlation between the traditional overall score and self-assessment score. The second thing is we advised HEE with a threshold appointability score that we felt was safe, and that should trainees this year meet that threshold score, they would have been appointed in previous years. The third thing I know has caused a lot of anxiety is gender bias. So for orthopaedics, we've got data which shows there's no evidence of gender bias with self-assessment. Josh, you discussed validation. The other thing that I think we need to talk about is the error. So I don't know if everyone's aware, but there was an error with the marks for orthopaedic trainees. It came out yesterday. So only 50 jobs were given out, and then it was highlighted because a few trainees added up their scores and they didn't quite match the scores that HE had given. So it's a bit of an embarrassing situation that we find ourselves in, but I'm told it was a computer programming error that's led to this, and I think it's affected around 50 trainees. The problem was their scores were 2 marks out, which meant they didn't quite meet the threshold when they should have done. Those trainees should now have been notified, and that should have been corrected. So that's what's happening at the moment. So all orthopaedic trainees should have their scores. I know there's been a lot of concern, but all I can do is reassure you that BOTA have been trying to advocate for our members throughout.
Brilliant, thanks Trish. I know, I mean, speaking to the other specialty associations, they've been doing much the same, which is important in this current situation. Jane, are there any questions with regards to national selection? Now might be a good time to take some, if that's all right.
Hi, yeah, we've got a couple. If anybody has any further questions, can they start sending them through? We will, if we get to the end and people have had questions in the meantime, we will come back to national selection. But if you do have any, now is a good time. So we've got a couple of people asking about the validation processes. One for orthopedics, basically asking whether or not it wouldn't have been better, in your opinion, to hold back on recruitment,
Yes.
which I realise is...
So when this whole process started, we put forward our ideal views and what we would want, and it was made quite clear from HE and the statutory education bodies that putting training on pause was not an option. So that simply wasn't a possibility. It was something we thought about though.
Okay. A similar question, although from an ENT candidate, it said, will the self-assessment scores that have been, restart that. Will self-assessment scores of successful candidates be validated? Does anybody have any? For ENT or other specialties?
So thinking back
There's
to
no validation for orthopedics. I think it's just neurovascular.
Oh, okay.
Josh, go on. Sorry.
Josh.
So for general and vascular, the scores will be validated using the 30%, which I mentioned earlier. For the specialties, there's no validation in place.
Josh, did you have anything to add?
No, I think it's been made quite clear that there's no validation and the reasons why, but I don't think people should be overly worried about there being no validation, because this is, with orthopedics in particular, people submitted their self-assessment forms before we knew that this was going to happen, and I think, you know, people submitted the forms prepared to defend it at interview. So if you're prepared to defend it at interview, I don't think we can now suddenly be panicked that it's not valid.
I think that's fair, Trish. I think the issue is in certain specialties, not necessarily in orthopedics, there, for want of a better phrase, there are different ways of playing the self-assessment form, and linked to what I said earlier, there will be people who are modest and underscore, and there will be people who potentially, with or without insight, overscore. And I think there was some anxiety amongst trainees that if they fell into either of those categories, they could potentially be penalised. And there was often quite a few requests or suggestions that could those scores be changed after the submission prior to the assessment of the scores. And when we asked that question, the decision was no. I completely agree with that. You know, I guess as an applicant, you know what the score was prior to submission, but what you didn't know was that was your only means of assessment for this recruitment round. And so I have some sympathy for those candidates, and I think it's just important that we don't set a precedent going forward that this is how people are analysed and how jobs are given out. Gareth,
no, I think this is, you know, this is unusual circumstances. This is by no means going to be the norm. I think we have to accept the situation that we're in at the moment.
Yes, I completely agree. It is a situation that's been forced upon us by circumstances. The SACs didn't want this method of selection either. They wanted validation. They even wanted appointments to LAT posts rather than NTN posts. But the statutory bodies through the MDRS overruled that, and we have to abide by the decisions that group took.
We've had a couple of people asking follow-up questions regarding what would happen with tie breaks. So clearly in a specialty like trauma and orthopedics, there is a very narrow spread of marks. Could somebody explain how candidates with exactly the same score applying for the same job would be differentiated, including if they have the same score across the domains?
Trish, do you want to take that one as TNO?
I don't know the exact specifics of how it's done, but it's done on a matrix. Gareth, do you have any details of the specifics?
I don't have the specifics for each specialty, I'm afraid, but I know that each specialty was asked to list a hierarchy of domains that would be gone through in sequence in order to break ties.
And sorry, as follow-up, in the unlikely or the potential circumstances where at that point they were still tied, is there any insight as to how that would be resolved, or is that one for a specific recruiter?
Having been involved with selection and seeing the scores that come out of portfolios, and once you start going down into tie-breaking scores, I think the chances of a continued tie after all the hierarchical domains have been exhausted is extremely small.
Okay. And we've had somebody also asking how are the domains ranked in case of a tie? Is there a weighting given to any specific domain?
There's no weighting to a domain, it's just the rank order of which domain is taken as the first tie break, and if it's still tied, which domain is taken as the second tie break.
And does that vary across the specialties?
It will do. Each specialty was asked to give their own hierarchy.
Okay, we've had a follow-up of the follow-up. Someone's saying that there were, sorry, I'm just reading. So a comment from a participant saying that given the 12 domains, that there is a chance of people having the same score. I don't know enough about the details.
Yes,
I think
the
if
details from the specialties haven't been released publicly, to my knowledge, and I think Gareth would agree with that. If the person asking the questions sticks down what especially they've applied to, I can put them in touch with the chair of the Trainee Specialty Association to try and answer that, who'll have a direct link to the SAC.
Perfect.
It may not be that they disclose them at all. It may not be that disclose them pre-decision, but we can certainly ask the question.
So the specialty in question is trauma and orthopedics. So I would imagine you will instantly pass that over to Tricia.
Yeah. So if you could just tell a person to email covid19@bota.org.uk, we can get it sorted.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much for that. There's also somebody asking that if there is a tie, is there any opportunities for people to be offered lat posts? Nothing in the...
There won't be lat posts in England. Lat posts will be on offer in Scotland, where there is a vacancy due to the absence of an NTN holder for a specific time period, but there won't be any lat posts in England.
Okay. Timing wise, I'm mindful that we've got 4 topics to get through, so I'm going to ask the panel to move on if that's agreeable, but we are still getting a few questions back, and I will come back to as many as we can in the final session if we have time.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So,
We can always come back if we've got time. Should we move on to the next slide and hand over to you, Gareth, to give us an overview on ARCP and outcomes?
Yeah, thanks very much. Given that trainees were going to progress following the very first high-level decision from the statutory bodies, there needed to be a process to manage ARCPs, recognising that COVID would have an impact on the training delivery and the ability to collect evidence that all the requirements of the curriculum have been met. Also a recognition that the availability of people to run panels may be limited. And so the slide is showing the principles that the statutory bodies have released. And this is in the public domain. It's on the statutory education bodies' websites. And these are essentially various derogations from the Gold Guide, which the Gold Guide does permit in unusual circumstances like this. So the number of people that comprise an ARCP panel has been reduced. The minimum previously was 3, it's been reduced to 2. And each of the colleges, and JCST and the SACs are included, have been asked to describe what the minimum requirements would be for a portfolio to be accessible under the new ARCP process that's going to take place this year. We've also been asked to identify any bits of evidence that could be described as compensatory that wouldn't normally be acceptable, but under these circumstances would be, to make up for any evidence that it may not be possible to get. We've also been asked to identify critical progression points, those points that are absolutely essential for trainees as they move from one level to another through training. And although there are 1 or 2 specialty specific ones in surgery, the key ones in surgery are that CT2 or ST2 up to ST3 level. Then there is the ST6 level, or it's ST5 if you're in max fax or urology. That is the progression point that allows you to sit the FRCS exam. And then the final progression point is ST8 or the ST7 in max fax and urology. which obviously allows you to proceed to certification. So those are the main critical progression points that we've mentioned for surgery. We've emphasised that people at those critical progression points really must have an ARCP, along with trainees who are already on a non-standard outcome, so an outcome 2 or an outcome 3, they really must have an ARCP. We're hopeful that most ARCPs will be able to be held in surgery, but we have to prepare for a situation where it isn't possible for that to be the case. Then there were the really important decisions to introduce these new ARCP outcomes, which recognise the impact of COVID, 10.1 and 10.2. These are for trainees who have been otherwise progressing satisfactorily, but they recognise through completely no fault reasons that COVID has impacted on their attainment of competencies. So a 10.1 would be used where a trainee is not at a critical progression point, and there's some aspect of the curriculum that's not been met, but they're able to proceed to the next level with a plan to gain what they weren't able to proceed during that next level of training. 10.1 can also be used as a critical progression point if there was a curriculum requirement that we have been able to agree with a GMC could be waived just for the period of this next training. So the typical example of that would be a run-through trainee in ST2 who was planning to sit the MRCS in April, but it was cancelled, and so they weren't able to. Normally, they would have been held back at ST2, but because the MRCS was cancelled due to COVID, and if they had been progressing entirely satisfactorily otherwise, they could be awarded a 10.1. They would be allowed to proceed to ST3, but the requirement would be that they'd have to pass the MRCS before the end of ST3, and that would be in their personal development plan. So that's a typical use of 10.1 in surgery. 10.2 is for trainees who are at a critical progression point where there is no derogation to the curriculum requirement. And so this would extend training in a no-fault way, recognizing that it was COVID that was the problem. And the typical example here would be either a core trainee who has not yet got MRCS and therefore was not in the selection process for ST3, or an ST8 trainee who still needs to pass the exam in order to get their ARCP 6, but the exam's been cancelled. These trainees need more time in order to be able to pass the exam. And what we feel is that it's very important that these trainees are protected and kept within a training program and given every opportunity to pass that exam within the training program, rather than simply ending their training program and then leaving them essentially to have to get the exam by themselves. So the 10.2 in those situations would extend their training. It would keep them in training so that they can sit the exam when they're next held. Where it is possible to use the normal ARCP outcomes, they should be used. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. So I've summarised there what these outcome 10.1 and 10.2 can offer, and we'll leave that slide on the screen as we move on to the discussion about this matter. Thanks, Jane. Or Josh.
Brilliant, thanks, Gareth. Jane, before we go on to the question from the audience, Gareth, do you mind if I put you on the spot a little bit?
Sure.
If there is I'm a general trainee, take a general trainee as an example, who, sort of, maybe they're ST5 and they have had quite a tough time during coronavirus up until the point of being redeployed or surgical services stopping in their hospital. They were completely on track, their numbers were fine, and actually they've met all the curriculum criteria which are required to progress. But actually in themselves, they don't feel confident, they haven't done a laparotomy in 4 or 5 months. they've had a really tough time, what can that particular trainee do to try and help with the process in terms of getting the right outcome at ARCP?
Yeah, I completely recognise that point, and it is particularly important at certain progression points, particularly depending on local hospitals and how rotas work and what's expected of trainees as they move to another level. What I would suggest there is that the trainee has a really good final meeting with their educational supervisor and has a really frank discussion over what they feel their concerns are, demonstrating that they've reflected on the experience that they've already gained, but also on the time that they have been redeployed or the difficulties that they've had, and how they feel, if they do, that they are not yet ready to go to that next stage, and emphasize that to their educational supervisor, who really then ought to put that into the educational supervisor's report that would go to the ARCP panel. And on top of that, the trainee has the opportunity, even after all steps of the learning agreement on the ISCP have been completed, to add their own comments that will be visible to the ARCP panel, reiterating that fact about their own feelings about moving to the next stage, so that the panel can take that into account. And also speaking with the TPD, because the TPD will be responsible for where that trainee is then placed, even if they do move up to the next level, but it's where they are placed in that level and the level of support that they can get in it.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Thank you. Jane, should we go to the floor for questions?
Yep, very quick. So somebody was asking a follow-on question from what you have just been discussing, basically asking if it is possible to ask for a voluntary extension. We had a similar question on Instagram ahead of the event as well. So if people aren't comfortable with progressing, they can ask for a voluntary extension with no sort of onwards impact to their training or their CCTs or likely success in the future. Is that, if I understood that correctly?
The answer is to have the discussion with their educational supervisor and to indicate to the educational supervisor that they're not comfortable yet to progress, and the reasons why that is, and to put their own comments about that into their portfolio on the ISCP, and to discuss it with their training program director, so that it can all be taken into account by the ARCP panel. But the Gold Guide, and there hasn't been a derogation to the Gold Guide about this, the Gold Guide doesn't permit simple, bald, if you like, trainee choice on outcome.
Okay. Jane, before we take another question, Trish, was there anything specific from orthopedics with regards to outcome 10 or ARCP which you wanted to highlight? Or
yeah, just to highlight that regarding to exams. So for ST6, if you have an outcome 10.1, you're still eligible to sit the exam. So to make that point clear, I know people are anxious about that.
Brilliant.
Yes, that's absolutely right. That is the advice that we are giving. It will require the educational supervisor to confirm that the trainee has the knowledge and the clinical skill required for ST6. And the reason for the 10.1 is one of the other competencies. Because the exam is set at that level. So it's important that the trainee is at that level, but a 10.1 would permit the trainee to sit the exam. But that is something, that is one of the derogations that we're going to have to put to the GMC. And so we will need to get GMC confirmation of that before we can be absolute.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gareth. Trish, any questions on the floor on 10 or
so one of the questions was exactly what Trish is doing. You guys are doing a great job of preempting questions as well as giving answers. So thanks for that. So we've had somebody asking about how you would best engage with the ARCP panel, given that ARCP is being held in absentia.
So Gareth, the guidance that I know I received today from my deanery said that where possible, ARCPs will be done using telecommunications or teleconferences. But from my understanding, those at progression points will be prioritised, and it's the expectation that not every trainee will have that option. Does that fit with your understanding?
Yes, as you know, the actual ARCP decision itself is done with the trainee absent.
Yeah.
But there really needs to be a face-to-face discussion after that decision has been made with one of the senior members of the panel. And that won't change, obviously, this year. The key communication point through to the panel, again, is through the educational supervisor. And we've emphasised in our guidance that the educational supervisor's report will be absolutely central to the ARCP panel and will allow a lot of the compensatory evidence to be presented within the AES report. But also that's where the concerns are addressed. If a trainee has concerns, that is the route to get at the panel.
I think it also goes back to the normal basic principles of engaging with ISCP and documenting. So although you may not be having the experience that you want, you can still reflect on what you've done so people can see what you have been doing on a daily basis.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a short section of that at the end in the fourth section. Any other questions, Jane?
Yeah, we've had a couple more follow-on questions. So somebody asking if the JCST will be able to reassure trainees that full ARCP panels will be made available, especially for those receiving negative outcomes.
We have emphasised in our guidance that we would want an SAC liaison member to be on the panel for a trainee who is already on non-standard outcome, and for those trainees who are at critical progression points. It's really the critical progression points that matter at this. But the derogation from the Gold Guide has been written to allow only 2 people to be on the panel. But having said that, there's a complete recognition that the ARCP process this year needs to be flexible, and that wherever possible, progression will be permitted.
Okay. Super. Okay, so we've had a question asking, will outcome 10s be applicable for the next couple of years, given the long-lasting impact of COVID-19?
Go on, Gareth.
Shall I take that? It's not been written in stone, yes or no, the answer to that question. The implication in the documentation is that the outcome 10 is available this year, but that at the next ARCP, the implication is that it would not be available. But it doesn't say that it won't be available. And if this disruption continues, and if we're in the same place next year, then it would seem to make sense that the option is retained for next year. We have to hope we're not in that situation, but we just have to wait and see.
I think that's the key. Specialty representatives outside of surgery, they've had the same conversations with their JCST equivalents, and I guess we just don't know how long this is going to last for at the moment. And so watch this space. We haven't been told yes or no yet, but we just haven't been given the answer.
Okay, so I've got a couple more on ARCP, and then I think we can move on. So we've had an ST7 who has previously been on track for an outcome 1 and only ever received outcome 1s during their training. If they're falling behind on elective operating, can they still get an outcome 1 with a chance to catch up, or would this be a scenario where an outcome 10.1 would be issued?
I guess it depends on their specific numbers, because if they have reached their index procedures and all the numbers they need to, and this isn't impacting that, then they should be fine. However, if they haven't met those numbers, then it may be looking like a 10.1.
Okay.
Yeah, that would read as per the definitions of the outcomes.
Well, thank you. And this one is a bit of an ARCP/CCT question, so I'm going to pop it in here, but we might follow up on it again later on. So is there the equivalent of a 10.1 for those due to gain CCTs, i.e. if you've been on track, can you still be signed off if your indicative numbers haven't been reached?
So the standard is remaining the same. You still have to achieve the certain things, because we can't suddenly say actually the standard we've had before, this next cohort of trainees are going to achieve a lower standard. I think that would be unfair. So you still have to achieve the benchmark. If you're struggling because of COVID, and you need extra time, then that would be a 10.2 to give you extra time to achieve those.
I guess, Gareth, in terms of progression and numbers for a given time period across specialties, we've had confirmed that they'll be done on a pro rata basis.
Yes, especially the workplace-based assessments, we recognise that it may be very difficult to get those at this time for all manner of reasons, and so they would be pro rata. But I think the point Trish makes about certification and not wanting to lower the standards, the clinical and operative standards at certification, that's really important. And although the numbers in curricula are indicative and that they're not intended to be used absolutely precisely mathematically, they are indicative. But if an ARCP panel feels that a trainee has not been able to get the level of experience that would be required to be able to manage the range of pathologies that they could see as a consultant, then they would have the opportunity to use that 10.2 to extend that trainee's training in a completely no-fault way, so that they can get the experience, so that they can be comfortable when they become a consultant.
Super. I'm again, sorry to push us on, but I'm very mindful of time. So if we want to move on now, and again, if we have any pressing ARCP questions, we'll address them at the end. Thank you.
Brilliant. Trish, do you want to head up rotations?
Yeah, sure.
That's all right.
So again, it's something I've had a lot of questions about with regards to when will we be rotating. So the next big rotation is all. We've got nothing definite as of now as to whether or not we will be rotating. Waiting input from the 4 educational bodies on this. Most likely we will be rotating in August, because of the implications of having new trainees coming through the system, if we don't move people on, but we don't have a definitive answer for that as yet. So we will update you as soon as we have that information. So that's rotations. Should I talk about CCT and fellowship at the same time, because they're kind of intertwined?
Yeah,
so
okay.
I've had some questions about going on to fellowship. So if you're an ST8 trainee, you've met all your requirements for CCT, you can then go on to your fellowship. If you haven't met the requirements, it's, as we said before, it'd be an outcome 10.2. So post-CCT fellowships are still going ahead if you've met the requirements. It's the in-training fellowships that aren't taking place at the moment. So I think if you are due to to go on fellowship, the important thing is to communicate with your fellowship director, as things are changing all the time, and kind of just keep updated so that you don't miss a slot should something become available. With regards to UPI, again, there's a lot of regional variation on what's happening with UPIs. I know some people have been called back. Myself, I'm out of programme, working at Health Education England, and I haven't been called back as yet, but I know people in other regions have been. So again, that's something to kind of keep in contact with your local offices about. The other thing is that there are no new requests for UPIs are being taken at the moment. Again, something that may change as the situation develops, but as it stands, no new requests are being reviewed. Josh, do you want to talk about UPARs?
Yeah, just very briefly. So UPAR decisions, application for consideration for applications that are already in and taking up UPARs for those where funding agreements and head of school approval are in place, vary from between the 4 educational bodies. So depending on which country you're practicing in, it will vary on what the decision of that is. So make sure you check the correct educational body guidance on UPARs, because there is slight variance between them. There's been a few difficulties in surgical trainees who are currently UPAR and wanting to, or have been requested to come back as part of the COVID response, and have asked whether or not they could use that towards their training time, which I know, given the introduction of the new competency-based curriculum, perhaps is slightly not as much of an issue as it used to be. But the advice, and speaking to Gareth about this earlier, is if there isn't agreement with the head of school for you to come back into a training program, such that you're just pausing your PhD and helping out on the on-call rota or whatever it is you're doing, then that couldn't be used as a training program placement as such. Another issue that a lot of academics have had is the liaison between funder, university, who normally holds the funding, and local trusts. And the best situations that have been resolved have been with really early communication with all three of them, and just complete transparency into the situation, whilst using your academic supervisors to guide you on that. I'm more than happy to take questions from any academics who have them, but perhaps something for off call. So I'm more than happy for people to email me if that's appropriate.
Do we have any questions, Jane?
Just need to remember to unmute myself. Sorry about that. We have got a few questions on a couple of different topics. A quite straightforward ones. What is the national standing on rotations due to start in October?
So we don't
We
know.
haven't had information on August, so we've definitely not got any information on October.
There you go. So we've also had a question. So will TIGs be signed off even if only 5 or 6 months have been completed? And will your CCT date therefore stay the same or be brought forward?
I might pass that one to Gareth, I'm not sure.
I can take that one. What we have advised with TIGs, and we'll be putting a statement out about this. We'll be putting a statement out about this very soon. Is that a trainee who is currently in a TIG will have their achievements looked at by the TIG group and assessed as to whether or not they have met the requirements of the curriculum. If they have, then recognition of completion will be given. You don't need completion of the TIG in order to get your certification, because it's an optional component of the parent specialty curriculum. And all trainees on a TIG will already have been on track to get their certification. And so non-completion of a TIG due to COVID wouldn't prevent certification from going ahead. But if the TIG group felt that, in all honesty, it was not possible to say that the TIG requirements had been completed, then there'll be every option for that trainee to return to the TIG once things settle down again, and they would have the first priority, if you like, to get at the TIG training posts, because we know that they are small in number.
I'm going to unmute myself this time.
Thanks, Jane. Are there any other questions for this?
So we've had a comment that was at the end there, somebody's understanding was that interregional rotations, which I think the October rotation was alluding to, was going to be a decision for individual specialties and regional TPDs.
No,
I don't
it's
know if anyone knows any different. It's an HE decision.
HE decision as to whether or not rotations will go ahead.
Okay, thanks for that. Slightly not really. We've had a trainee asking about the impact on medical problems, which I'm going to make an assumption here. So sorry if I'm wrong. I'm assuming if you're having to isolate because you're in a vulnerable category, what's the impact for them going to be on rotations and/or progression?
That will have to be a discussion that they would have with their local TPD and head of school. The basic principle of not allowing COVID to adversely impact on training would apply, though. And so if a trainee is having to shield themselves because of a medical condition, then I would anticipate, although I can't say for sure, but I would anticipate that they would have every opportunity to go back to where they were at the time that they had to start shielding, and that would be a head of school dean type decision.
So it would be being treated similar to a maternity leave or similar?
Yeah, and occupational health would be involved as well, and the provisional certification date, of course, would be looked at and changed as it would if you're having extended sickness leave.
Okay, just double checking that we haven't got any other questions for this section. We have had a few questions which again sit in a bit of a funny category, and I think we can probably head off a few more regarding resumption of the FRCS and the impact to CCT dates. We had it as an advanced question. We've definitely had it through Instagram, and we've had it a couple more times this evening. So to head one off.
Sorry, Jane, can you just repeat the question? I didn't quite get what the...
So sorry, I'll just bear with me 2 seconds. So with social distancing likely to continue for some time, do we know when the FRCS will restart, and will an alternative award of CCT be given instead, or adjusted, or CCT dates adjusted?
So it goes back to the same principle that the standards remain the same. You will still need the exam to CCT. That's not going to change. We don't have a definitive answer as to when exams are going to start because we don't know what's happening. I think we're trying to work towards a November date, but that's on the information we have now and hoping that things start to get back into normal, but it may not, so we'll have to revise that. Again, it's one of those things where as soon as we have more information, we will share that with trainees.
Yeah, so I know the 4 Royal Colleges, Jane, you'll know from an English point of view, are in talks to try and add extra capacity to upcoming diets. But obviously that's affected by if social distancing measures go on for longer than we expect. And completely reiterate Trish's point about we've not received any information to be able to CCT without your exam, and that looks likely to remain in place.
That's absolutely correct. And if ever we were into that sort of position, that would be a discussion we'd have to have with the GMC as the regulator of the curricula and the standards that people need to meet. We're not at that point at the moment.
That's good. Okay, I'm again mindful of time, so I'm going to ask you guys to move on and have a brief chat about the documenting of COVID-19 experiences, and then we will try and answer a few of the outstanding questions at the end as well. Thank you.
Sure. Gareth, do you maybe want to go over the JCST guidance on voluntary recording, and then I can briefly mention Logbook.
Thanks for that, and thanks for input from trainees as well on this. We recognised, as did the heads of school recognise, that trainees may voluntarily want to record their experience and activity during a COVID-related placement if you're redeployed because of COVID. And so we have set out some guidance which is published on the JCST website, and how to get at it is at the bottom of that slide. If you go to the JCST website, go to the key documents button on the homepage, and then at the top of that is the COVID-19 guidance. And within that, you'll see guidance on voluntary recording of COVID-19 related experience. And that document takes you through how to record a placement if it's a COVID-related placement, and what we'd like you to do so that it becomes relatively easily accessible to people looking at your portfolio and to yourselves. It's entirely voluntary, but if you want to do it, it's there. And then also beyond that in the document is advice on how you could use workplace-based assessments, even in a COVID placement, to record valuable evidence if you want to do it. And we all know how CBDs work and CEXs and so on, but we've added in there some hints as to how these could be used in a COVID placement if you want to do that, and if you can find someone to do it. If you can find a supervisor to do it, then they could either register as a user and get an account on the ISCP, or you could download the form from the ISCP and then get it completed and then upload it to the miscellaneous section of your portfolio. Either way would be equally valid. And then towards the end of the document, we have put a link to the ASIT COVID logbook, which is a logbook of activity that you could use to list what you do that's related to COVID-related care, if you wish to do that. And then also how to use the existing miscellaneous form on the ISCP in a longitudinal fashion to record your experience, your reflections, what you felt of it, what you think you learned, what was difficult, over a placement, so that we're suggesting that this one form you would just save and draft and then just add information to it as and when you felt you wanted to do so. And then only submit it either at the end of your placement or if it got full, if you reach the character limit, and then in which case you could start another form. But on the document on the on the JCST website, we've put in suggestions there as to what you might want to record if you wanted to do that. I must stress that these are entirely voluntary and you don't have to do it, but it's there if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to repeat the ASIT logbook, I guess when we put our heads together, Gareth, we anticipated that making big changes to the ISCP platform in such a short space of time wasn't going to be possible. And so an external document which could be uploaded separately would be quite useful. Again, completely voluntarily, at any frequency people would wish to do it. I guess given the emphasis, and this is perhaps something that I hadn't considered until now, on the educational supervisor report in certain trainee ARCP circumstances, having some form of evidence, although it's completely voluntary, may help aid that discussion. Would you agree?
Yes, I would certainly agree with that. I don't want to sound, though, as though this is voluntary, but you really ought to do it. That's not the case. It is truly voluntary.
So I think that brings us to the end of all the itemised topics of discussion. I wonder, Jane, if there are any outstanding questions which we could get through.
Definitely have some outstanding questions. So we've got a couple of things that are sort of loosely related to this and to ISCP, so I'm going to club those ones together. I'm aware of the fact that we don't have anyone directly representing the ISCP this evening, but we have had a couple of people asking if we think that the ISCP new curriculum will still launch in August.
Well, I think I can speak for the ISCP. I hope I can.
Didn't want to presume, sorry.
I'm delighted to say, as people may already know, that we have received approval for our curriculum. There are some actions that we need to take, but they are very manageable and we can achieve those. The question now that we've received approval is, when do we implement it? And people may already know that we've started a consultation on this. It's going to be a pretty short consultation because we need to get an answer out there simply to answer the question that we've just been asked. And within that, there are some dates suggested. Each has pros and cons. There's August this year, October this year, February next year, or August next year. And we're starting to get feedback now on these, and we'll make that decision once we've got all the responses back. We're just opening this consultation for a week.
Yeah. Thank you. Again, on an ISCP kind of area. So there's been a question about will there be the opportunity to send tickets to non-registered users? Will that be available on ISCP as it is with other platforms, or are we suggesting that the ASIT logbook and similar resources will be able to be uploaded into ISCP?
So there are a few options. Non-ISCP users won't be able to do it. I've tried. You can use the ASIT logbook as one option. You can write as continuous prose in the reflection sections, or you can print off the forms as a PDF, handwrite them, which is a little bit of a faff, but it means you can stick to the same pro forma that you normally use, and then scan them in and upload them as a separate document. Those are the options which I've seen that can be used. Gareth, I don't think there's any additional.
Yes, I think there were two questions there, really. It is entirely possible to upload the asset spreadsheet and any other documents as attachments to the miscellaneous form. The other question, I think, was about registering other users onto the ISCP, and it's perfectly possible to do that, as I mentioned before.
We've just had a similar comment as well.
I think it links to on certain portfolios which non-surgical users use, they can do it as a temporary user. So you just get a link and you can sign something off. Whereas at ISCP, you have to register with it.
We'll try and include that information in the post-event email as well. So with some of the more general questions, we will try and add in the appropriate links and sections of things like the ISCP and the JCST websites, just for clarity for people. We'll also include the link to the new asset logbook as well. We've got a couple of other questions if we want to move on.
Yeah,
there's just one point before the next question. During COVID placements, obviously everyone's under pressure and stress, and they cannot be easy placements to work in. So we just have to recognise that some of the supervisors there may not be surgeons. They may not have any idea what the ISCP is and how it works. So we do just need to recognise that as trainees want to try and capture their experience and just be sensitive to that.
Super. We've had a question which I think is more of an opinion than anything else that somebody's seeking. Should surgical trainees be being redeployed to medical wards if the medics are overstaffed and surgeons have fewer patients than usual?
Difficult question. The natural answer to that would be no. But I think across the country, from speaking to our regional representatives, there's been a mix of, I guess, top-down approach working and trust being ahead of the game, or departments getting their own ship in order quicker than the trust has been able to plan. And so I think there's a bit of a mismatch in certain areas in terms of resource distribution. I guess if it was a question, the answer to it would be to feed back to supervisors, to your educational supervisors, TPDs, that actually we don't feel we're a bit surplus to requirement, and actually we could be getting back to whatever normality looks like in your area. I guess for surgeons, normal activity isn't quite what it was prior to COVID, and so actually ensuring that we're maintaining the COVID response as the priority for the moment until we receive instruction from the higher powers, I think is probably still the most important thing, given that we're sort of around the peak or beyond the peak in certain areas. I think we just need to make sure that we remain pragmatic and keep the COVID response at the forefront of what we do for now.
Brilliant.
Trish,
Thank you.
anything else to add to that?
No, I fully agree. Yeah, I think with these things, they need to be discussed locally. And there are things you can do if you don't feel it's appropriate, but that's definitely a local discussion that needs to be had.
Yeah, I'd agree.
We are coming very dangerously close towards the end. I've got a couple more questions I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to bring us to a close. Couple of outstanding quick ones. If you have not marked that you would like to work part-time at the time of application, but have changed your mind since the COVID outbreak and you're offered a job, are you going to be able to work part-time?
I think normally it's 6 months notice you have to give for less than full-time, but I would just get in touch with the local office as soon as possible and let them know, no, I'm not sure.
It would be the local deanery, local office of HEE that you would need to go to for that. So head of school would probably be the first port of call.
Yeah,
I'll do it as soon as possible.
Trish, on less than full-time applications in light of COVID. I don't know if you have.
No, I know previously you need to give 6 months, but I would just say if you're thinking about it, call up your local office and have that discussion sooner rather than later.
Super.
Yeah.
We've had a couple of people asking about other opportunities or missed opportunities due to the COVID epidemic and how they stand. So beyond exams. So for instance, if your courses or conferences that you would normally be putting into your portfolio have been cancelled, where do you stand when it comes to either next year's applications or current progression?
So I think the only course that I can think that is mandatory is ATLS. I can't think of any others that you would need for progression. With regards to ATLS, I know that if you're coming towards CCT and you haven't got your ATLS, you need to demonstrate in some other way that you can manage trauma patients, may be that by CBDs and things. But I guess it's again one of those things where if you haven't been able to go on the course that you would like, you can plan for it in the future and document that you plan to do it in the future.
What we've said about courses for the final ARCP is that these are in the area that can be looked at by the panel. And you're absolutely right, it was only ATLS or APLS within ENT. And this is where we can give some flexibility. If the trainee has some other evidence that they are able to manage trauma through what they've done in the past, through their WBAs, through their supervisor's reports, then we don't need a course like that just to hold them back from certification. They can always do it afterwards.
And I guess in terms of application, I suspect this is probably a more junior trainee in terms of ST3 applications the following year. I guess my advice would be to be a bit more pragmatic about the marks that are available for applications and perhaps focus your efforts on those that you could do remotely or from home whilst social distancing measures are still in place. But also there are a number of conferences who are going to take place hopefully after social distancing stops and hopefully after travel restrictions go away. They may also then facilitate ways of presenting where you don't have to leave your house. So I know a couple of the RSM conferences, for example, are doing them completely remotely, and so that would give you the opportunity to present and get those points for your applications for the following year. Because obviously we don't know how long it's going to be until travel bans are lifted, and that will probably be a little bit later, we suspect, than any social distancing measures are lifted.
And we have highlighted in our returns to the statutory bodies that the person specifications for ST3 entry will need to be looked at for next year. So this fallow period of COVID is recognised.
Following on very quickly, and I think after that we will probably be drawing to a close. Somebody has asked about things like CRISP for trauma applications.
Same applies really to what we've just said, I think.
Just demonstrate.
Yeah, so similar answer.
Okay, brilliant. Somebody asking very specifically about, and I think you may have covered this, but I think there's an element of clarification required. So if their ATLS is expiring and they don't have a chance to do the re-verification due to the pandemic, would they be given an extension to the 4 years or an extension until it's next available?
What we have said is... Go ahead, Trish.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it depends what level trainee they are. And if they're ST8, that goes back to what we were saying before about evidencing that you can manage trauma patients in a different way.
That's right. And that the lack of an ATLS we have suggested needn't prevent an ARCP 6 as long as the rest of their portfolio demonstrated that they were capable of managing trauma sufficiently well. They can always do the course if they felt like they needed to do it afterwards. And I know the statutory bodies are looking into how funding for that might be delivered.
Okay, and so really is the final question now, I promise. So somebody is just again asking for a bit of clarification. The flexibility that is being given to pre-CCT trainees to continue, and I'm assuming that this is people referring to the ARCP 10s. Yeah. Is that at the discretion of the educational supervisor or training program director, I think their point is that if you're missing out on key training at a senior level, it's unfair and potentially a concern for patient safety.
So I don't understand the question.
So I think they're asking.
I think it's bringing in the element of choice, which we discussed.
Yeah, I think it probably is. Sorry, as I read it out, it made less sense. Sorry to the asker. So it's possibly. So the first question is it at the discretion of the training program director?
It's the
The outcome
ARCP.
10.
So it's, sorry, Gareth, can you repeat that?
Is what at the discretion of the program director?
Is the progression?
The ARCP panel.
The ARCP 10 is that it's at the discretion of the ARCP panel, so the local panel. Okay.
As it always.
And then I think the second bit is more of a comment that if you're at a senior level and you're missing out on subspecialty training, that even if you ticked all the boxes, that there would be concerns. But again, I think that comes back to this notion of a discretionary extension or an optional extension.
Yeah.
Sorry, I made a bit of a hash of the last question. My apologies for that.
Hopefully that clarifies it. Yeah, I think it's similar to the scenario we discussed earlier, but just from a competency point of view rather than a trainee wellbeing point of view.
Yeah, super. Thank you. Okay, so thank you all. We've got a couple more slides if we could just flick on. So first, as a member of the public, I would like to thank all of the NHS staff for all of their great work, including our panelists who have given up time and in some cases some very precious sleep time to be with us tonight. So thank you to you all. And if we can just move on, if I can do a quick plug for next week, we are returning to the presidential Q&As for next week. So we'll be doing a reflective piece looking at what we've achieved in the last month and where we are compared to when we started with the president and hopefully with some other panelists. So if you are available, please do join us for that. And once again, if you want to keep up to date with anything, please follow us all on social media. And can I extend my thanks to the panelists for this evening, and good night.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks.